Welcome to our Module 2 Stormwater Treatment Concepts, Chapter 4 Stormwater Treatment Mechanisms, Physical, Chemical, and Biological. Let's take a moment to look at what you covered just in the last chapter. In last chapter, Chapter 3, you were introduced to the topic of stormwater type, which are structural versus non-structural or post-construction, pre-treatment, and temporary best management practices. And we learn how stormwater acquires and transports pollutants downstream. We learn how stormwater can be polluted. We understood what the pollutant concentration, load, and categories are, and we learned the effects of pollutant on receiving water. Back to Module 2, Stormwater Treatment Concepts, Chapter 4, Stormwater Treatment Mechanisms of Physical, Chemical, and Biological Processes. Our learning objectives for this chapter are to learn the fundamentals of the three types of the treatment processes, the physical, chemical, and biological processes. Learn how to evaluate the effectiveness of different practices, understand how models are used in evaluating stormwater practices, and know how treatment trains removal mechanisms work. Stormwater treatment practices versus stormwater treatment processes. So what's the difference between the stormwater treatment practices or the different types of the stormwater practices versus that of stormwater treatment process or concepts or mechanisms? Well, as we have covered earlier, stormwater treatment practices are the many different stormwater practices or types that we use to treat runoff. A water quality pond, a green wall, and underground treatment facilities as pictured here are all examples of different types of stormwater treatment practices, where each one is used to treat runoff or eliminate pollutant, but each uses a little different process to do that. So stormwater treatment practice is the different types of practices that we use, and stormwater treatment process is the system, processes, and the mechanisms, or you can think of it as the internal engine that each practice uses to treat runoff. These diagrams shown here is perhaps a better way of showing the differences between stormwater practices versus stormwater treatment processes. Imagine that we place in the path of runoff, as shown here as number 1, various types of practices as illustrated here by number 2 that use different processes as shown here as number 3 to capture pollutants and treat runoff. So we place stormwater practices in the path of runoff to capture pollutants. Stormwater treatment mechanisms are different form of stormwater practices. A stormwater treatment mechanism is the method used in a stormwater practice to capture or treat the required pollutants and improve stormwater runoff quality, as well as reduce runoff volume or peak flow, or the practice may use a combination of different mechanisms. What's important to remember is that most of the times any of the stormwater practices may use multiple treatment processes or mechanisms to achieve the same goal. There are three primary stormwater treatment processes. A useful way to understand pollutant reduction in a stormwater practice is by classifying treatments into physical, chemical, or biological processes. Again, important to note is that a stormwater pollutant removal in a treatment practice is likely to rely on several pollutant removal processes. Let's take a look at each of these processes. In our stormwater physical processes, our treatment relies on separation of pollutants, but without changing the form of the pollutants or any chemical reactions. We can divide physical mechanisms or physical processes into filtration and sedimentation processes. Let's take a look at the filtration process. Think of filtration like a kitchen strainer. When I cook pasta in a pot on the stove, I have both pasta and water in the pan. When it's done cooking, I pour the pasta and water through the strainer. Now imagine the pasta is actually suspended particles such as soil. The suspended particles, which is in this case would be pasta, are retained in the strainer while the water passes through. Now the strainer will eventually, of course, get clogged if we put enough pasta in it. Similarly, if we filter water with suspended sediment through a granule media like a sand filter, the filter will eventually get clogged and they all do. Therefore, maintenance in the form of scraping, backwashing, or other form is extremely important for filtration processes. Filtration is an important physical treatment process. It relies on interaction between the particulate pollutants and a media that can trap the particle because of its size or attraction to the media. Stormwater filtration medias include granule beds, fabric, and fibrous filters. Our other physical process is sedimentation. Sedimentation of particles is other important physical process used in many stormwater practices. Examples include sedimentation where the particulate pollutants sink within the stormwater device fast enough to accumulate in the bottom. Gravity pulls stuff heavier than water to the bottom of the device, and of course, larger, denser particles will settle more quickly and smaller particles slower, but soluble and colloidal particles may not settle at all. Sedimentation process is always a significant part of any stormwater practice. Hence, the need for pre-treatment, which by itself is another process which we'll be talking about more later. Just a quick recap that there are three primary treatment processes. A useful way to understand pollutant reduction in stormwater practice is by classifying treatments into physical, chemical, or biological processes. Stormwater pollutant removal in a treatment practice likely relies on several pollutant removal processes. The next type of stormwater process is chemical process. Chemical treatment changes the form or structure of the pollutant within the practice. In many cases, the pollutant is converted to a form that can be retained within the practice itself or converted to another form that poses less harm and can go downstream with runoff. Some examples of chemical processes include sorption, precipitation, oxidation, and photolysis. The process of sorption is shown in this diagram. A quick note to keep in mind is that in a sorption process, which is still a chemical process, the material merely attach to something else, but they do not form a bond with another material or change forms. Whereas in a chemical reaction, as shown here, the materials form a bond with each other and therefore change form. Either way, in other cases, the pollutants can be altered to another form that is also considered a pollutant. For example, particulate phosphorus could react within a treatment practice to form soluble phosphorus, which is still problematic if it's carried downstream. Our third stormwater process is biological processes. Biological treatments occur when plants or microorganisms incorporate the pollutant into a growing cell or convert the pollutant to another form. This includes assimilation of nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus into biological cells. It also can include reactions in microbial metabolisms that alter pollutants. Examples include the breakdown and the oxidation of organic matter, conversion of nitrate to nitrogen gas, transformation of pesticides and other pollutants to other forms. Let's have a quick exercise. Can you name, define, and tell the difference between the three main stormwater processes? Several mechanisms and processes at play. Another reminder that these fundamental processes act in concert together to make a stormwater practice work. The main takeaway is that several processes of pollution reductions may be operating within each individual stormwater treatment practice. A stormwater infiltration practice incorporates many individual pollutant removal processes. Stormwater infiltration practice, for example, incorporates many individual pollutant removal processes, including settling and filtration of solid as water passes through the media, biological decomposition of organic matter in the media, adsorption of phosphorus on the media, and partition of pHs into media organic matter. Similarly, a wet detention pond incorporates several pollutant removal processes as well. For example, settling of solids as water remains in the pond, biological decomposition of organic matter in the pond, and settling of metals associated with the particles entering the pond. On the other hand, a treatment wetland incorporates a lot more yet of pollutant removal mechanisms, including settling of solid as water is stored within storm in the ponds, biological decomposition of organic matter in the pond, settling of metals associated with particles entering the pond, incorporation of nitrogen and phosphorus into vegetation in the wetland, partitions of pHs into organic detritus in the wetland, and oxidation of ammonia to nitrate in the pond, and possible denitrification of nitrate in heavily vegetated areas of the pond. So the main takeaway is that again, several processes of pollution reduction may be operating within each individual stormwater treatment practices. That same concept is also true when dealing at a larger scales and with multiple stormwater practices. We used to think that placing one practice in the path of runoff was enough to remove all pollutants. But then we learned that was not the case, that no single practice or process can remove all sorts of pollutants. Therefore, we now use a method called treatment train, where we place multiple practices in the path of the runoff to gradually or stepwise to remove as much pollutants as possible, and only allowing minimal amount to pass through, as shown in the arrows in this diagram. So you can see we're starting with much pollutants at the beginning, but as the runoff goes through each practice, the amount of pollutants and its toxicity is reduced as it goes through different types of stormwater practices. Again, the reason here is that because multiple processes of pollution reduction are needed in both each individual stormwater practice and in the different practices used to effectively treat the runoff. Treatment practice effectiveness. The concept of treatment practice effectiveness is at the core of stormwater management. We would never want to use a practice that's not effective, right? It would be merely waste of resources and capital. So how do we know if these practices are effective? Treatment practice effectiveness. Treatment trains combine removal processes. It may be most effective to utilize a number of treatment processes to reduce stormwater pollutants. Combining two or more processes is called stormwater treatment train. By implementing more than one process, the operating lifetime of an individual practice may be increased through the removal of contaminant that would otherwise shorten the life of the downstream practice. They can also decrease the required size of the downstream device by reducing runoff volume and pollutant load upstream. For example, where we may have a swale before a water quality pond and then followed by an infiltration area, where swale removes larger particles before the wet pond and the wet pond removes smaller sized particles before getting into the infiltration area, where some of the water or runoff is infiltrated into the ground and reduces the volume of the runoff. All in all, the vegetated swale before a wet pond followed by infiltration reduces the size of needed wet pond by lowering downstream volume. In scenario 2, imagine having a rain garden before a wet pond before the runoff goes into a treatment wetland or a constructed wetland. In this scenario, the rain garden removes particles ahead of the wet pond, plus allowing some of the runoff or the water infiltrate into the ground, and that also allows for the reducing the runoff volume by allowing infiltration. Then as the runoff reaches the wet pond, the particles or the smaller particles may still settle to the bottom and form sedimentation, and finally runoff reaches into the wetland, where soluble contaminant may be treated through chemical and biological processes. Expressing and predicting the effectiveness of a treatment process. Treatment practice effectiveness can be expressed in different ways, but not as shown in this picture. However, it could be expressed by the following two questions. What is the percentage of the pollutant removed by the practice? The answer to this question could be that the effectiveness of a practice can be described by the pollutant load leaving the practice relative to the load that enters. A common example would be a wet detention pond, where the fraction of the pollutant leaving depends on the settlement rate of the incoming particles, the volume of the pond, and the size of the timing of the storm. What is the pollutant concentration leaving the practice? In this method, the practice is described by concentration of a pollutant in the water that leaves the practice regardless of the incoming concentration. This would require removal effectiveness that is not dependent on the storm size or the stormwater composition. An example might be a filtration practice where the passage of the water through a media prevents larger particles from leaving. While the practice may eventually stop functioning because the rate of the water moving through slows and water may need to bypass the practice, during the time the practice is operating, the concentration of the filtered water may be very low. Okay, time for another exercise. Take a few minutes to explain what each of the following sentences measure and how do each relate to understanding the effectiveness of a stormwater practice. Question 1. What is the percentage of the pollutant removed by the practice? Question 2. What is the pollutant concentration leaving the practice? Again, explain what each of the following sentences measure and how do each relate to understanding the effectiveness of a stormwater practice. Predict treatment practice effectiveness. Predicting the effectiveness of a treatment practice can use models that incorporate description of the pollutant reduction process. For example, some mechanisms rely on the rate at which the pollutant is removed. A model can calculate the time the pollutant spends within a practice by comparing the volume of the water with the quantity of the runoff. For example, the settling of particles in a wet pond varies with the size and the density of the particle. Several stormwater treatment models use a distribution of settling velocity within a stormwater to project the effectiveness of particle removal. In wet detention ponds, the size of the pond, amount of the runoff, and time before the next storm will determine the fraction of the incoming particle that will be removed. Models can estimate the capacity or lifetime of a stormwater treatment practice. These models compare the pollutant's loading with the capacity of the removed mechanism. For example, the rate of the accumulation of sediment within a wet detention pond in comparison to the rate the sediment load is removed. Similarly, the ability of a treatment practice to absorb entering pollutants relates to the absorption capacity of the media plus plant uptake capacity and biomass density, which is plant material harvested, as well as the initial pollutant load of the treatment practice. In this model, the comparison is of the incoming pollutant load with the quantity of the pollutant that can be absorbed or harvested. Now, as an exercise, look up the section with more in-depth discussion about stormwater modeling. That concludes our Chapter 4. Thank you.